The first officer to step out of the cruiser did something nobody in that cul-de-sac had seen before. He snapped a salute at the man standing in a battered tux, right in the middle of a wilted wedding arch. People laughed, then stopped. Cameras craned. The HOA president, a woman with hair like bleached linen and a stare that could sour milk, was on her phone, pacing, shrieking, then went very, very quiet when the salute landed. The gravel underfoot clicked like brittle bones. Something about that pause made everyone lean forward, as if the air itself wanted to hear what would happen next. They had come to cut a cake and dance. Instead, they were met with flashing lights and an argument between a homeowner and a woman who treated bylaws like a cudgel. The smell of frying oil from the food truck mixed with diesel from the cruisers. The groom's shoulders shook. He tasted copper and adrenaline. Someone shouted a question. "What did she say?" And the answer came in a sliver of overheard accusation. "She called 911, said there's an illegal gathering." For a second, the whole scene snapped like a taut wire and then went quiet again. "Wait, what just happened?" Flashback. 6 months earlier, the narrator, Eli Martin, 42, retired search and rescue lieutenant with a tendency to file things away like evidence, had thought his neighborhood was ordinary. The houses sat in a neat row, each lawn a slightly different shade of ritual green. The cul-de-sac hummed with lawnmowers and children's laughter. The air tasted of chlorine and cut grass in summer. Eli liked that order. He liked the way rules could be relied on, the same way a map lets you find a lost child in the dark. That discipline is why he had kept his head when the first note came. A laser-printed letter slipped under the door about a compost pile that was unsightly and non-compliant. The HOA president, Marjorie Whitcomb, was 57, trim, with a clipped mid-Atlantic accent that slid easily into venom. She wore little brooches shaped like keys despite never having let anyone past her guard. She drove a silver SUV that always seemed to arrive exactly when someone was trimming hedges or hanging wind chimes. She owned the neighborhood like a woman who collected small tyrannies as trophies. She collected names, too. The mailman, the teenager who mowed lawns, the woman who left a window open with a potted basil plant on the sill. Marjorie had a power lever, a family money line threaded into the county planning commission, and she used it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel, with clinical precision and just enough flourish to leave a mark. The conflict began small. A warning about paint colors, a compliance notice about a porch banner, a fine for a mailbox that leaned at an improper angle. Each pettiness was a trial balloon, launched to see how the neighborhood would react. Eli smelled bleach as he read the first fine, a physical, chemical dryness that matched his nausea. "You're overreacting," his wife Noor had said once, tasting lemon from a dishcloth. "She's just a busybody." Eli filed the letters in a stack labeled Whitcomb. He kept them because he wanted a record. The house smelled like coffee and paper, and he liked the way the edges of the fines lined up on the desk like soldiers. If she wanted to wage war through memos, he would answer in evidence. That was his training. Collect, document, observe. The first knowledge drop came in an argument on a humid Tuesday, when Marjorie left a heavier notice tacked to the front door. A threat to fine them for excessive exterior decorations during Eid because the HOA board claimed historic uniformity. Eli wrote a reply and walked it to the mailbox, the envelope warm against his palm. He paused on the sidewalk and said, loud enough for the neighbor to hear, "Under most state HOA statutes, boards must provide written notice and a hearing before imposing fines. They can't just issue penalties out of whim." The neighbor, Mrs. Lagos, who smelled of jasmine and laundry starch, blinked, surprised. "You mean they can't just bully us?" she asked. "Not without due process," Eli said. He could see the fine print unspool in the neighbor's face like a curtain. That first legal fact landed like a lit match. It wasn't lawyering, it was practical. Bylaws had teeth only if the board followed procedure. The smell of jasmine and the taste of his own optimism were both present in that moment. Marjorie escalated anyway. She cut the flowers from the community garden one night, 2 women later saw her, gloves on, scissors shining like knives, and left a handwritten note accusing the gardeners of unauthorized landscaping. She complained to the county about a shed in a yard 2 doors down. She wrote a letter insinuating that Eli's contractor had installed a non-compliant deck without permits, even though the deck's permit number sat laminated in Eli's glove box. The sound of scissors snipping in the dark echoed in the neighborhood like a threat. People started to pick sides. Some admired her discipline. Some were wearied into silence. But a few, like Noor and an elderly neighbor named Mr. Hines, who liked rum and old jazz records and who smelled like tobacco and cedar, started to loosen their tongues. Noor tasted salt when she told Eli she'd been stopped at the grocery store by a woman who whispered, "Your husband keeps making trouble." The whisper lingered like cheap perfume. Eli's tactical edge, his habit of saving receipts, taking photographs, recording conversations, meant he had something Marjorie didn't expect, a literal paper trail. He photographed the compost pile, before the fine, the angle of the mailbox before the notice, the shed's permit. He cataloged dates like a medic logs injuries. He knew from experience that the smallest discrepancy could topple a dictator. He had seen how a single overlooked file could free a man trapped under rubble. Here, perhaps, a single permit would topple a petty regime. The second scene of escalation was almost absurd. An HOA meeting held in August under a corrugated canopy by the community pool. The sky was a white, hard slab. The air felt like standing under a steam iron. Marjorie presided with a clipboard and gloves like a traffic conductor of righteousness. Her voice had the brittle cadence of someone who believed order equaled virtue. She read the agenda as if it were scripture. Fines, appeals, landscaping variances, a new quiet hours rule that seemed tailored to the family that liked barbecues on Friday nights. At that meeting, Eli noticed a detail that looked wrong, a clause in the minutes that didn't match the signed version he had received. The pen strokes were different. The ink bled in a way that suggested a different pen. He could taste metal in his mouth, a dried, steely tang that often precedes anger. He smelled sunscreen and the greasy tang of burgers, and he felt the roughness of cheap plastic chair under his thighs. He asked for the original minutes. Marjorie frowned, lips pursed like a trap. "Those are not public until the board certifies them," she said. Eli had the minutes she sent publicly. He had the unedited email chain where she instructed the secretary to amend the wording. He felt that old gnawing sensation, something in the engine of power that didn't add up. He asked Noor to read the minutes later under a kitchen lamp, their fingers touching the paper's edge, the ink glossy at the corners. "She's changing the record," Noor said, smelling coffee and worry. "That's illegal," Eli murmured. 2 months in, the neighborhood's rhythm changed into a pattern. Monday, stickers on cars for parking violations. Tuesday, fines. Wednesday, a rumor. The HOA, under Marjorie's direction, began targeting small personal things: wind chimes, vegetable gardens, holiday lights. The harassment spread like mold in damp wood, touching everyone's life. People whispered on stoops and old grudges came to the surface. The smell of cut grass became a background to arguments, the taste of coffee bitterer each morning. Eli's counterattack was methodical. He recruited allies with improbable personalities. Ms. Rivera, a code compliance nerd who liked to argue with city inspectors and who chewed fennel seeds loudly. Malik, an electrician who smelled like motor oil but had a soft laugh. And Priya, a local reporter who liked to keep files in her purse like extra lungs. They became his small council. They met in garages and at the back table of a diner where the coffee tasted of burnt caramel and the vinyl cracked under pressure. They swapped documents, photographs, scratched notes, and clumsy jokes that banished the fear for a few hours. Each person added a piece to a puzzle that, stitched together, began to look ugly and illegal. At a neighborhood potluck over the smell of paprika and roasted peppers, Priya read aloud an email where Marjorie had suggested creative enforcement. The phrase felt like a threat in a dress. "Creative enforcement," Priya said, the vowels sharp. "That's not a phrase for a community board. That's a phrase for a mob." A child dropped his plastic fork. It clattered loud in the sudden silence. Midway through the conflict, Marjorie's tactics turned from petty to surgical. She printed a glossy flyer implying the Martins were running a commercial Airbnb, false but damaging. Flyers appeared in mailboxes, sotto voce conversations at the PTA turned sour, and a thin smear campaign took hold online. Someone, Marjorie or someone close, had access to the HOA's email list and used it to spread gossip. Eli tasted iron again. His hands were steady as he took screenshots, saved web pages, tracked IP addresses with Malik's help. He found that some of the emails had been routed through a third-party service, meaning someone had masked the sender. The air tasted of burnt toast. The second legal fact arrived like a cold rain in an already soaked night. During a hearing where Marjorie demanded fines for disturbing the community peace, Eli stood and spoke. He spoke with the cheap authority of someone who had toiled in triage and had spent long nights writing incident reports. Boards can't weaponize private email lists to run smear campaigns, he said. Using association resources for personal vendettas is a conflict of interest, and in many jurisdictions, constitutes misuse of HOA funds or authority. The words landed with the weight of a measurable thing. Noor smelled lemon from a dish towel she'd wrung in her hands. Mr. Hines, who'd been silent apart from the soft shake of his cane, tapped it against the pavement in agreement. That legal fact reshaped the argument. It meant the emails could be subpoenaed, the HOA's vendor invoices could be audited, and Marjorie might have to explain who authorized the flyer printing. Suddenly, the war had teeth beyond gossip. It was not merely hurt feelings. It was potential financial abuse. The neighborhood whispered with renewed interest. People liked the idea of accountability. Noor put her palm flat on Eli's arm. It felt warm and human. Marjorie didn't retreat. She doubled down. She discovered a clause in the HOA's covenant that, if interpreted in a certain punitive way, allowed the board to impose remedial assessments for non-conforming structures. She convened a special meeting, and with her allies on the board, voted to examine the Martins' deck for non-conformity. The moment the vote passed, Eli felt something old and ancestral, the cold spike of being ganged up on. He tasted bile. The community's mood shifted darker. Sprinklers were timed to drown out outdoor gatherings. A drone hovered one night, its hum like a bad conscience, above a backyard barbecue. Someone punctured tires on a car parked in front of Noor's parents' house. The sound of rubber slumping over tarmac was like a body giving up. The couple across the street, who had once waved at everyone, kept their curtains drawn as if the sun itself might bring gossip through glass. Eli's small wins were private and slow. He collected vendor receipts showing the HOA's printing bills. He recorded minutes where a board member had smirked about taking care of the Martins. He secured affidavits from neighbors who'd seen Marjorie cutting the community garden. Each file felt like a splinter he could lever out later. He slept with his phone beside his pillow, the vibration a constant threat. Then came the betrayal. A week before the wedding, when invitations were already pressed and the cake tasting was done, someone leaked a recorded phone call. It was a recording of Marjorie speaking to a county inspector saying, "If we need to, we'll call code and have them tow anything that's not permitted." The recording was thin and scratchy. The voice was all hiss and the faint rustle of paper. Noor pressed the phone to her ear and whispered, "She's planning to shut everything down." The taste of metal returned in Eli's mouth. Eli played the recording for Priya and Malik in the back room of the diner. Coffee steamed between them. Priya's eyes were flat. "That may be illegal," she said. "There's a line between enforcement and a targeted campaign to deprive someone of their property rights." Malik, wiping his hands on his jeans, said, "If she calls code to physically remove something without an order from a court or proper notice, that's a problem." Eli's breath hitched. He could see where this was headed, a wedding canceled under the guise of code enforcement, guests turned back by men in uniforms because someone with influence had decided to weaponize bureaucracy. He tightened his jaw and thought like a man who had once mapped the route out of a collapsed mine. First, he would build redundancy. He made sure the wedding license was printed and notarized, the venue permit photocopied and triple-checked. He took a video of the deck where the ceremonies would happen, steady as a surgeon's hand. He printed the permit for the deck and laminated it. He put it in the glove box where it would be seen. He made a folder of all the HOA fines and legal correspondence and slid it into his coat. He tasted the bitter satisfaction of preparedness. On. The day before the wedding, a letter arrived, formal, embossed, warning of immediate remedial action. It mentioned illegal assembly, in language that smelled like someone trying to dress a lie in bureaucracy. Marjorie's name was stamped at the bottom. The gravel outside Eli's house crunched under his boot as he took the envelope into the kitchen and sat under the yellowed light. Noor stood by the sink, water running, the house smelling of lemon and worry. She looked at him and said softly, "They can't do this without proper notice, right?" He could see the question, like a sliver of bone. He wanted to be blunt. He wanted to stand on the porch and tell the world what he'd collected. But his training said otherwise. Expose your hand only when the opponent has no time to recover. He closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. His fingertips felt papery. He folded in silence. The neighborhood felt heavier, like a sky before storm. The drone's hum seemed to be back. Someone somewhere had turned a microphone on. The cold open returned faster than anyone expected. At the rehearsal dinner, Marjorie appeared uninvited, an apparition in beige with a small hymn of offended noises. She stood at the edge of the backyard, hands clasped as if in prayer, and watched the couple practice vows. Her SUV was parked under the jacaranda tree. Its engine ticked and cooled, smelling faintly of oil. She looked triumphant and small. Her cheeks were flushed like paper. "You shouldn't be here," his father said, the words thick with protection and wine. The crisp sound of a snapped twig punctured the moment. Marjorie turned. "I'm ensuring compliance," she said, voice thin as ice. "We're a private association. We enforce code." Noor felt anger like a hot stone. She stepped forward, the heel of her sandal pressing into damp grass. The smell of mulled cider from the caterer mixed with the sting of arguments. "This is our home," she said. "You have no right to harass us." Marjorie smiled like a razor. "We have bylaws," she said. Eli felt his past, years digging people out of collapsed roofs, years mapping out the logistics of rescue, fold into a strategy. He had trained to see the smallest chink in a structure. He had a plan. Not let the opponent manufacture the narrative first. Document everything. Keep the moral high ground. He would not be baited. He called Priya and whispered into the dark, "If they try anything tomorrow, record it. If they call anyone, get the call logs." He could hear her shoes on linoleum. She promised. That night, a note appeared stuck to the guest book at the rehearsal, a typed message accusing them of illegal commercial activity and repeated disturbances. The paper smelled of damp ink and malice. Someone had put a smear where joy should have been. The note read like a threat folded into an insult. Eli slept badly. He woke tasting metal and the dust of old buildings. He checked the permit folder, twice. He checked the deck screws. He put his hand on the wood and felt the grain, smooth and real. He thought of his father's hands, capable, weathered, and felt a small, thin flame of defiance. The next morning, as guests arrived and the cake stood frosted and nervous in the kitchen, a neighbor came running up, panting and smelling of motor oil. "She called 911, he gasped. "Said there's an illegal gathering and asked them to send someone." Eli's chest tightened like a vice. The sound of a lawn chair scraping concrete sounded far too loud. Room temperature seemed to drop. Noor zipped her dress. The fabric was cool under her fingers. She said, "They can't," but didn't finish. Guests murmured, forks pausing midair, the smell of icing and coffee suddenly tasting like fear. The groom's face went something between incredulous and resolute. Eli stepped outside, the gravel gritty under his shoes, and saw Marjorie on her phone, lips moving like a tiny, angry mouth. Her expression was smug, a woman certain of the righteousness of her own pettiness. He could see her power lever in motion, an invisible thread tugging on civic officials. He thought of the salute, the officer who had later stood and saluted, a groom in a tux, and wondered about the lines between law enforcement and civic power. He could taste the metal of resolve. Then, before he could decide what to do, he heard the thump of footsteps and the crank of a radio. The sound of the cruiser was a low growl approaching. People moved like fish in a net. The camera phones rose. You could taste the electricity in the air. The next move would decide whether a wedding would be stopped by procedure or protected by people who could see the difference between governance and tyranny. Eli felt the old, practiced calm of a man who had to make life and death decisions, steady breath, assess, act. He reached into his coat for the laminated permit. The paper's edge stamped his palm. He unfurled it like a flag and walked toward the arriving cruiser, toward whatever would happen when an HOA's accusation met a man who had kept his receipts and his friends and his promise. And then the first officer stepped out and gave a salute that made everyone hush. The salute landed like a question. The wedding held its breath. The woman who had been trying to end the ceremony, Marjorie, had been stunned into silence, but she was not beaten. Her eyes narrowed, and in them you could read the plotting of the next move. The cliff had not fallen away, a new one gleamed just below. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far HOA power reaches. If you've ever been bullied by a neighborhood board, type yes so we can count the brave. This isn't just one fight. It's the start of a takedown that's about to expose a scandal people will talk about for years. The air smelled like cut grass, diesel, and the faint lemon of Noor's handkerchief. Eli's hand gripped the permit until the paper creased. The sound of the cruiser's radio carried snippets of static and a dispatcher's voice. He tasted resolve. He breathed in that hot, juried silence. A knock came, sharp, authoritative on. The HOA's front door the next afternoon, and the neighborhood learned that bureaucracy could both threaten and be threatened. The knock was a small sound. Its echo would be monstrous. The records Eli had been laboring over would do more than just prove a point. They would force questions. Who authorized the flyers? Who paid for the printing? Who called code out of spite? Eli did not know at the moment the officer saluted how many traps Marjorie had dug. He only knew the map of her pride and that maps could be redrawn. He only knew the texture of the proof in his coat pocket and the way Noor's fingers found his at the sight of the salute. The next few days would demand all his careful planning and the courage of a small collection of neighbors who were done being afraid. He could feel the story bending toward a showdown. In the quiet after the salute, he realized something else. Power often falls when someone both sees the truth and decides to act. The collision was coming. The cliffhanger stretched its hand. The file folder under his arm crinkled. The wedding cake in the kitchen waited like a quiet witness. The smell of icing lingered like a promise. The neighborhood's calm cracked like a windshield. The fight had begun. They thought the salute had been a sign of mercy. It had been a warning. The morning after the cruiser's flash, the cul-de-sac hummed like a hive tooled up for war. Coffee smells rolled from open kitchens. A lawn sprinkler hissed, kitten soft, and then stuttered under the weight of 1,000 whispered plans. Phones vibrated in pockets, notifications pinged like distant gunfire. Eli watched neighbors gather, in webs, tight knots of faces, hands, and whispered maps, while he held the laminated permit in both hands as if it were a talisman. The backlash was immediate and petty in the way bullies choose small knives. Marjorie circulated another community advisory, this one printed on glossy stock and delivered by hand. The paper smelled like toner and something colder. Intention. The flyer accused the Martins of hosting commercial events and warned of penalties up to towing. Her signature, neat and regal, sat under the threat like a coronation. People read it and leaned in as if the ink might spread contagion. Eli's first instinct was to catalog. He always cataloged. He photographed the flyer, the date stamp on the envelope. the route the delivery person took. He tasted metal on his tongue, an old pressure that signaled focus. Noor smelled lemon and fear and folded the leaflet into the trash with trembling hands. But before she could, Mr. Hines picked it out and read aloud, voice like gravel over a tin roof. "They're trying to scare people into silence," he muttered, and the words struck like a bell. A week of micro-sabotages followed. Jose nozzles were pinched to spray guests arriving for small family dinners. Someone cut the strings of hanging lanterns. A neighbor's mailbox was slashed in the night, the paper inside steamed with the scent of rain. Marjorie's allies on the board employed a pattern of enforcement that smelled like choreography. Complaints funneled through the HOA's email, inspectors called at odd hours, fines assessed for small, fixable infractions. Each act was a pinprick, meant to annoy, meant to bleed. Then came the media whisper. Priya, who had a tape recorder habit and a curiosity that smelled like black coffee, placed a byline in the local news. She wrote about petty enforcement and how creative compliance translated into life disruption. The piece did not name names, but the angle was sharp. It read like a pulse check for the county. Something is off here. The article tasted of possibility. Marjorie's face when neighbors waved the paper in her direction was an exercise in controlled rage. She had not expected the story outside the cul-de-sac. She had expected the quiet that comes with anonymous control. Eli watched her from across the street, the newspaper a folded muscle in his hand. He could see the lines at the corners of her mouth deepen, like tectonic plates beginning to grind. He could see her vulnerability, the twitch of a hand when someone mentioned audit, the way her jaw clenched if a phrase like misuse of funds floated in conversation. It was a small fissure revealed in a woman who spent a life pretending. She wasn't fragile. That vulnerability became a lever. Eli and his team, Malik with his grease-scented hands and practical jokes, Ms. Rivera with her encyclopedic memory of municipal code and the small sound she made when she found a discrepancy, Priya with her recorder and reporter's nose, began digging not for scandal but for balance. Malik set up a spreadsheet. Ms. Rivera cross-checked invoices against vendors. Priya subpoenaed public records she didn't have the right to subpoena. She asked, politely and loud, and officials were either careless or helpful. The pattern emerged like a map sketched by a patient hand. The HOA had been paying for community outreach printing, costs that lined up suspiciously with Marjorie's personal vendors. A third-party company with a P.O. box in a neighboring city had printed the smear flyers. The invoices had been coded under miscellaneous, which smelled like obfuscation. Eli could feel his old rescue training shift into detective mode, map the terrain, find the weak structure, wedge. At 500 words into the war, the first legal fact cut through the hum like a blade. A homeowners association board owes fiduciary duties to the members. That meant the board had to act in the community's best interest, not its president's vendettas. Using association funds or resources for personal attacks can be a breach of those duties, and it opens the board to audits, removal votes, and even civil suits. Eli said this out loud at a potluck, between the taste of grilled corn and the clink of plastic plates, and it landed like a thrown stone. People began to ask for receipts. That admission flipped the mental script in neighbors' heads. Suddenly, the issue was no longer a personality clash. It was potential financial malfeasance. They began looking at invoices, email headers, spent checks. Noor's sister found an email trail that suggested the HOA's outreach budget had been used to reimburse a consultant for community communications, a consultant who sent money to a private firm with ties to Marjorie's cousin. The smell of scandal slid into the cul-de-sac like damp cloth, but the other side had resources. Marjorie's family line at the planning commission meant she had friends in low places and some very loud influence. She began to tilt the machinery of governance. She petitioned for a compliance audit and used the HOA's legal counsel to draft injunctions that read like armor. The language was precise: public nuisance, immediate abatement, special assessments. It sounded like law. It felt like a sledge. Eli's countermeasures were surgical. He submitted his own records and formal responses. He filed a formal complaint about misuse of funds with the State Oversight for Homeowners Associations, a process that smelled like bureaucracy and paper but could produce subpoenas. He connected with a lawyer who volunteered to take on HOA matters pro bono, an old veteran of municipal fights who smelled faintly of smoke and defiance. The lawyer's name was Claire Hansen, and she had a habit of tapping the table twice before, speaking like a metronome setting tempo for a fight. Claire advised them on strategy: preserve evidence, get affidavits, call a special meeting petition, and start the clock for recall. She explained gently and with the precision of someone used to bloodless rooms that homeowners could petition to remove board members if certain procedural steps were followed. She did not promise a quick victory. She did promise procedure, the slow, grinding engine that favors those who show up with receipts. The HOA answered with legal fangs. They issued a cease and desist to Priya for her reporting, claiming defamation. They filed a motion to block the recall petition on procedural grounds. They threatened to fine homeowners for unauthorized dissemination of HOA documents. The sound of a gavel, metaphorical then, echoed in living rooms. The neighborhood's taste for safety soured. The campaign of intimidation escalated. A towing company with a reputation appeared at a block party and pulled the Martins' car under a pretense of expired permit. The tow truck's smell of hot rubber and hydraulic fluid was a violence. In the daylight, the driver's paperwork, when examined, had a billing address that traced back to a shell vendor listed in the HOA's invoices. Malik smelled the lie immediately and found a mechanic who saw the truck daily and said, off the record, that its runs were curated. Eli's team fought back with a blend of legal patience and street-level pressure. They organized a fundraiser to cover legal costs. They set up a social page and asked neighbors to post receipts of HOA charges, invoices, and strange payments. Someone made a thumbnail-worthy post. A photo of Marjorie's SUV parked in front of a printing shop at 2:17 a.m., toner stains visible on her gloves. The picture went viral in the cul-de-sac. It was a moment that would have made a hell of a thumbnail. The SUV, the smudge, the timestamp. "What would you have done?" Priya asked in the open thread, and the comments flooded. "Has your HOA done this?" Someone typed. "Type yes!" People typed, fingers shaking. The feed tasted of adrenaline and vindication. The algorithm of local outrage fed on each comment. Then Marjorie struck a new kind of blow. She called for an emergency board meeting and used a clause buried in the bylaws to force a temporary suspension of gatherings until an investigation concluded. It was a bureaucratic chokehold. The clause had been written long ago, vague, broad, a relic of anxious lawyers, and Marjorie had learned to wield it like a club. The meeting would be held in 2 days, she announced, in a room with poor acoustics and a microphone that favored the loud. The midpoint twist landed like ice water. Marjorie had legal cover, and she had the county's code enforcement sympathetic, because she framed it as public safety. The county inspector, someone who smelled faintly of ozone and bureaucracy, showed up at a garden party and cited a structural hazard on the Martins' deck, despite having no structural engineers report. The inspector's clipboard rattled. His voice was washed in protocol. The citation threatened a temporary closure until an engineering inspection could be scheduled, another delay and yet another potential way to freeze the Martins' ability to hold events. Eli felt the walls close like a cave. The plan had to pivot. He had been drawing maps with paper and ink. Now he needed to move in 3 dimensions and fast. If the inspector's citation could shut them down, he would use the inspector's own rules to trap the inspector. He called. A structural engineer walked him onto the deck and watched him run his palm along the handrail. Smell the cedar. Listen to the wood when struck. The engineer smelled sawdust and sunscreen and declared, on paper and under oath, that the deck met code. That report was a flat, solid piece of evidence that neutralized the citation, or at least made it more expensive to sustain. At the same time, Claire filed a motion to compel the HOA's financial records, citing fiduciary breach. The motion smelled like legal paper and quiet insistence. The judge's clerk stamped it with a number that felt like an acid burn, formal, irreversible. With the motion in place, subpoenas could be issued. Vendors who had been comfortable with miscellaneous payments suddenly grew prickly. The game had changed. Marjorie's confidence flickered. The second legal fact cut through at the midpoint with the bluntness of a sledge. Many jurisdictions require that HOA board decisions involving assessments or fines follow specific procedural steps, proper notice, an opportunity to be heard, and documented minutes. If the board bypasses those procedures, its actions can be voided and the board can be removed. Claire used that fact as a battering ram in a hearing where the air tasted of stale coffee and tension. The judge leaned forward. A clerk adjusted. A microphone. The sound of paper being shuffled felt like armor being put on. Neighbors rallied with a new vigor. They signed the recall petition in numbers that made Marjorie's allies sweat. The lawn near the community center became a staging ground, flyers, folding chairs, and the smell of pizza boxes. Ms. Rivera organized a file cabinet volunteer operation. People came with boxes of HOA communications and donations of filing folders. The collective smell of paper, cardboard, and hope was sudden and thick. Marjorie tried counterplay. She dug up an old complaint about Noor's landscaping and had it reissued with a more threatening tone. She circulated allegations, thin, mismatched, that the Martins had been charging admission to events. But the community had seen too much. Now, the momentum shifted in slow, irreversible degrees. The battle got personal. Someone spray-painted a slur on the side of a neighbor's garage late one night. The paint's chemical tang hung in the air like a warning. Marjorie denied any involvement, her voice bland and clipped. Her public face was one of righteous order. But privately, someone saw her cry one afternoon under her hydrangea bush, grief quiet and human, the sound of a brittle woman breaking. Noor saw it because she had to pick up baking tins at Marjorie's house for a charity event. Small kindnesses that elicit surprise in war. That brokenness exposed a deeper weakness, financial strain tied to a divorce settlement years earlier, the rumors of which had been kept under polished lips. She had been borrowing influence because her own money was thin, and the veneer of control was compensating for fear. Eli didn't gloat. He'd seen the cost of humiliation in other lives. He knew that winning without conscience made a hollow throne. But strategically, the team found the choke point. If Marjorie's creditors were entangled with her political influence, a public audit of the HOA finances could expose systemic risk, enough to unseat her. The campaign's press coverage turned sharper. Priya's editor ran a feature that tied the HOA's peculiar expenditures to Marjorie's private vendors. The piece included the tow truck photo and invoices. The county's ombudsman called for an inquiry. The smell of printer ink and late-night editing became a new scent of progress. Then came a dangerous gambit. Marjorie hired a private attorney, expensive and stern, and filed for a restraining order against Eli, claiming harassment after a tense exchange at a board meeting where voices had been raised and accusations had been thrown like pebbles. The restraining order smelled like arsenic, legal, poisonous, and public. It was a move meant to freeze Eli's activism by painting him as a threat. Eli felt the old pulse of endurance. He had been in tight spaces, in rescue missions where every second counted and every breath was calculated. He called Claire and said, "They're trying to scare us into silence." She said, "Then we leak the receipts and keep going." The lawyer's voice was as plain as a drill turning through stone. The restraining order hearing was a courtroom scene that carried all the sensory dryness of bleach and polished wood. The judge's bench smelled faintly of lemon oil. The gallery smelled of nervous perfume and the metallic tang of anticipation. Marjorie's attorney spoke in clipped sentences that tried to make a man cleaning teeth of protest into a monster. Claire responded with documents, invoices, and a methodical clarity that had the effect of a flame-making shadow's retreat. The hearing ended with no order issued, but the threat had left its bruise. The neighborhood's momentum continued. The recall petition gathered signatures, and then some. The HOA's own engine began to clog. Vendors who had been complacent now worried about being subpoenaed. The board's minutes showed inconsistent handwriting and signatures that, when inspected closely, appeared different from the ones on file. Ms. Rivera, who had a thing for handwriting analysis the way some people had hobbies with stamps, pointed out a suspicious change in emotions wording and then the ink used in the amendment. It felt like a small, exquisite discovery, a private triumph. Marjorie's allies started to slip. One board member requested to resign for personal reasons and was seen leaving town overnight. The resignation smelled of oil and old whiskey in the early dawn. The man left his roses on the dashboard, and the petals were dry and brown, but the fight was not without cost. The Martins' privacy was compromised. Someone hacked into Priya's email and released half-formed drafts. The stress tasted like cardboard and grit in the mouth. Noor lost sleep. Her hairline had the faint sheen of worry. Mr. Hines's health faltered and he stopped coming to the park. The neighborhood felt worn, like a shirt washed too many times. Eli slept in shifts now, a few hours, then waking to check messages. He was not reckless. He was strategic. He set small traps. A request for the HOA's invoices was filed under public records. A request for meeting recordings was lodged. He had the patience of someone who had crawled through collapsed buildings listening for muffled voices. He knew how to wait while others made mistakes. Claire's subpoenas began to arrive. The vendors were asked to produce invoices, contracts, and proof of authorization. Panic spread through paper suppliers and printing houses. One vendor admitted that he had been told to code payments as community outreach. The admission tasted like rust. The vendor's office smelled of cheap coffee and guilt. Marjorie's reaction was twofold. She rallied in public, asserting loudly that the campaign against her was political, while privately, her voice over the phone had a tremor when she demanded more money from a relative. The vulnerability the neighborhood had suspected became tactile. Her hands shook when she signed a check. Noor saw it at a grocery store eyeing produce. Those tremors were not strategic, they were human. The legal engine churned. A hearing was scheduled to determine the validity of the recall petition, and the courthouse lobby filled with neighbors who smelled like wet coats in solidarity. Camera phones were out, microphones were held like talismans. Priya's report played on a local morning show that morning, and her voice was steady, her recorder's click a metronome. The tension rose and then snapped back as if a wire had been tested for strength. At a packed council meeting, the HOA's council attempted to argue that the recall petition was procedurally defective. Claire rose and walked the crowd through affidavit after affidavit, the sound of pages being turned punctuating her sentences. The judge watched with a face like wet cement. There was a moment, a thumbnail-worthy beat, when Marjorie's counsel faltered under a cross-examination about invoice approvals. The camera angle caught Marjorie's lips parting, the small intake of breath. The image would be a magnet for the news cycle. And then, at roughly 80% of the way through the act, the legal engine's crescendo, the third knowledge fact landed. Homeowners can force special meetings, petition for board removal, and if the board is found to have breached fiduciary duties, misappropriating funds, colluding with vendors for personal benefit, the state can remove the board or appoint receivers to manage HOA assets. Courts can unwind transactions and demand restitution. The fact sat like a dynamite charge beneath the HOA's porch steps, and it made Marjorie's allies look at one another with different eyes. The room smelled like pressure, and people leaned in as if they could hear the future cracking. Marjorie's face drained color. Her hand went to her throat and stayed there for a long second. The people who had once nodded at her orders now whispered repeal strategies and recalled timelines with the confidence of people who had tasted proof. But Marjorie was not yet finished. Desperation can be dangerous and creative. She scrambled for one last card, a lawsuit against the Martins for defamation, an attempt to both silence them and bankrupt them. Tactics like that are blunt and crude but effective in chilling activism. She thought the threat of legal bills would make them fold. But Eli had something else. A file of invoices that showed where her money had gone, accounts that tied the smear campaign to HOA funds, and a community willing to stand up. The act was closing. Cameras circled like vultures tasting a carcass, but the carcass had claws. The final scene of the act built to a cliff with an image so cinematic it would haunt thumbnails. Marjorie in a conference room, lights harsh and obsidian, her lawyer's pen hovering above a retainer agreement. On the other side of the table, Claire slid an envelope across the polished wood, evidence, affidavits, invoices. The murmurs outside sounded like a coming storm. People smelled rain and coffee and the metallic anticipation of consequence. Eli stood in the doorway, the smell of cedar and printer ink on his sleeves, watching as the lawyer's pen trembled. Noor touched his arm. Her palm was warm and steady. The courtroom and the community had become one long audition for truth. Voices rose and fell like tides. "Where are you watching from?" Priya asked later on the thread, and comments streamed, like a river breaking a dam. "If your HOA has crossed the line, say yes." The cul-de-sacs fight had become a story, and the story had legs. The pen hovered. The pause before it touched paper was a small eternity. Cameras flashed in the corridor. The lawyer's jaw tightened as if wrestling a decision. Marjorie's breath was a held thing. And then, before the ink hit the page, the door behind Claire opened, and a clerk stuck her head in with a stamped order and a subpoena that would pull more records into the light. The moment broke like glass. The act ended on that edge. Lawyer's pen suspended, camera flashes flickering like warning lights, a subpoena rustling in a clerk's hand. The neighborhood waited to see if the signature would fall, if the retainer would be paid, if the last gasp of a frightened queen would be enough to save her kingdom. What would you have done? Drop it in the comments. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes. The feed filled, and the cul-de-sac, once a quiet string of identical lawns, had become a raw, living testimony to what happens when rules are bent into weapons and neighbors decide to fight back. The courthouse smelled like lemon oil and old wood polish, but beneath that was the metallic tang of adrenaline. Cameras clicked in a rhythm like a metronome. Microphones leaned forward like hungry mouths. Eli stood with his hands folded over the folder that had become a kind of scripture. The invoices, the laminated permit, the engineer's report, the recordings. Noor's fingers found his in the gallery and squeezed. For a long, small second, everything else was distant. The soft scrape of a coat on a wooden bench, the faint rust of paper turning, the whisper of a camera strap against a reporter's neck. Then the bailiff called the case. The heart of the hearing was painfully procedural and theatrically savage. Marjorie sat with her posture practiced into armor, cheeks waxen, lips painted a color that could pass for composure. Her lawyer wore a suit cut from a cloth of threats. He carried a manila folder that smelled faintly of machine oil and that was heavy with intent. Across the aisle, Claire moved like someone who had learned how to win by being boringly meticulous. She filed motions, called witnesses, produced documents. The judge's gavel looked small in a room full of people who wanted what was fair. Eli felt the old operational calm. Breath in, assess, act. He'd trained for collapses where you had to find people under noise and chaos. This was a different kind of rubble. He had to find truth under layers of printed excuses. The first witness, a vendor owner with calloused fingers that smelled of toner and coffee, testified that invoices had been coded outreach while the work actually served a private campaign. The vendor's voice trembled when asked if he'd received direction from the board to print the flyers. "I was told to invoice it as community materials," he said. A rust taste rose in Eli's mouth. When the judge asked about procedure, whether homeowners had been afforded hearings, notice, and opportunity to contest, the board's narrative began to fray. Minutes that had been altered were shown under magnification. A secretary's affidavit, the handwriting shaky like a late autumn leaf, admitted to being pressured to amend a record. The gallery smelled like bleach and triumph. The camera caught Marjorie's jaw twitch. The board members shifted like mice in a trap. The small, constant sound of pens scratching on legal pads became a percussion that signaled pressure. Outside the courtroom, a news crew filmed a thumbnail-worthy tableau. Marjorie's SUV in the parking lot, a smear of toner on the fender, the timestamp on a surveillance still that matched a vendor invoice. The image would be shared and clipped and repurposed, an arrow pointing at how petty power collides with evidence. Priya whispered to a producer, "Make that the lead." The Feel of the microphone in her hand was warm. The camera's glass reflected a crowd. People were starting to smell the possibility of change. Then came the first legal fact in Act 3, dropped while the judge considered motions, a compact surgical knowledge bomb that altered strategy and tightened the noose. Code enforcement actions, including citations and orders to abate, generally require written notice and a reasonable opportunity to cure before a property can be removed or a gathering dispersed. Emergency exceptions exist but are narrowly defined. Immediate threats to life or safety. Using code as a pretext to shut down gatherings without documenting imminent danger can itself be an abuse of authority and subject to judicial review. The words landed like a beam across Marjorie's plan. That fact changed the tenor of the hearing. The county inspector who had shown up at the wedding, clipboard rattling, had not called in an emergency engineer. He had cited structural concerns and left. Claire produced the engineer's stamped report showing the deck met code. The room inhaled together, like a crowd hearing the whistle of an oncoming train and then seeing the tracks were clear. The inspector's voice, when he took the stand, had the flat lilt of someone who had followed procedure without excruciating detail. Under cross, procedural gaps gaped. The smell of coffee turned sharp. Marjorie watched the witness list shorten, like a day-losing light. Her breath hitched once, twice. Noor steadied herself in the gallery by tasting the stale caramel of a communal candy bowl. Small comforts became tiny rituals under pressure. Eli's hand, wrapped in the folder, felt like it was holding the pivot of a seesaw, the weight of evidence against the weight of influence. Outside, the hum of traffic and the distant bark of a dog kept time. Inside, legal breathing replaced adrenaline. The hearing adjourned for the day with the bailiff's boots, clicking like a returning tide. They returned home to find their cul-de-sac more awake than it had been. Neighbors stood in clusters, voices low and urgent, the scent of cut grass mixing with the accelerating electricity of a community ready to act. Ms. Rivera brought over a tray of samosas, spicy and oily, and set them on the table where Claire could pick them up between calls. Malik leaned against the fence, smelling faintly of motor oil and optimism, and said, "They overplayed." The phrase was small and satisfying. A neighbor joked, half laughing, "They thought we'd roll over." The laughter tasted like relief. The battle had reached the stage where small moves mattered. The HOA's counsel filed a response, thick legal paper stamped with a strategy, attack the petition's form. It read like a chess move meant to stall. Claire answered in kind. More affidavits, subpoenas keyed to vendor accounts, notices to produce bank statements. The folder beneath Eli's arm grew into a stack that smelled like office dust and resolve. The judge's calendar was a metronome. Every tick pushed the conflict toward a public reckoning. At a neighborhood meeting under the community center's dim lights, a room smelling of pizza grease and fluorescent bulbs, people practiced testimony. Mr. Hines, his voice ragged but steady, practiced a line about how the gardeners had been intimidated. Noor rehearsed the engineer's report in soft tones until the words felt like armor. Those meetings were more than logistics. They were rituals of solidarity. The sound of folding chairs and the rustle of papers became a soundtrack of resistance. A child ran by with the scent of bubblegum trailing. Then the board made a reckless move that would become a thumbnail for the ages. Marjorie, cornered, announced a sudden emergency levy to cover alleged community security expenses and claimed the power to issue fines retroactively for non-compliance. She posted the notice on the HOA's bulletin and sent it via their listserv. The notice smelled of printer toner and panic. It read like a trap, intimidating, vaguely legal, and meant to cow. Neighbors stared at their inboxes. Their faces went white like linens in the sun. Someone muttered, "That's overreach." Eli's temper was a low flame. He kept it practiced and cool. He called Claire and said, "They can't levy without a vote that meets the quorum and notice requirements in the bylaws." Her reply was crisp. "We'll move quickly to void it." The team mobilized. Priya prepared a press release. Malik posted photos of the notice with the vendor timestamps. The community feed filled with comments that tasted like vinegar and resolve. The levy was a flash of desperation and a sign that the board was bleeding. The second knowledge bomb came during a late-night call between Claire and the legal clerk. Discovery isn't just a paper exercise. Subpoenas can compel email logs, bank transfers, and vendor contracts. Digital trails often exist where paper trails do not. With properly issued subpoenas, forensic accountants can trace payments, unmask shell companies, and connect dots that boards try to bury in miscellaneous. That fact, small but potent, detonated across the team. If the invoices were matched to payments, the narrative of misuse could be proven with bank ledger clarity. They filed the subpoenas the next morning. The sound of emails being sent was a series of small explosions. Vendors found themselves answering under oath. A low, collective shiver ran through Marjorie's circle as someone mentioned a P.O. box that led to a ghost corporation. The smell of printer ink became the smell of inevitability. The vendor who had earlier admitted to miscoding invoices now produced bank statements that, under the glare of subpoena, showed transfers to a nominee company. The numbers lined up like a careful mural d'art. The court's discovery process unspooled more than expected. Emails were recovered showing Marjorie's instructions. A string of messages contained casual phrases, "take care of it," and "use outreach," that exposed intent. A printout of a payment schedule revealed a vendor being paid the night before a flyer run. The register showed no community event that could justify those costs. Each revelation was a small, irrefutable cut. The gallery watched as a narrative formed, not of neighborly governance, but of a campaign of personal vendettas funded by association coffers. The taste of vindication in the room was metallic and sweet. The community pressure tightened. Board members who had been comfortable in their seats now avoided eye contact. One resigned quietly, his hands smelling of stale coffee and relief. Another took a leave. The vacuum opened space for a recall. Notices went up on doors. A crowd gathered for the special meeting to vote to remove Marjorie and select interim leadership. The energy outside felt like rain before a storm. The air tasted of ozone and a fierce expectation. But Marjorie had one last gambit. She attempted to file for an injunction to freeze the recall vote, claiming procedural impropriety. The filing smelled like desperation. The hearing for that injunction was scheduled fast. The night before, the cul-de-sac felt both electric and fragile, like a string pulled taut. People slept badly. Noor lay awake, fingers pressed to the cool wood of the nightstand, tasting coffee and tension. Eli walked the yard, feeling the grass's damp touch, the sky the color of a bruise. The injunction hearing was a compressed war of paperwork and presents. Supporters filled the gallery again, smelling of takeout and community candles. Claire argued that the petition followed bylaws, notice, signatures, timeframes, and that an injunction would constitute an improper preemptive censorship of democratic process. She spoke in calm, precise sentences that pulled threads until the judge could see the tapestry. Marjorie had used association funds for personal vendettas. Recall was a lawful remedy. The judge sighed, the sound thin and final. The injunction was denied. The denial was the cliff's edge. Marjorie's lawyer clenched his jaw. Her face paled like flour against skin. Outside, supporters sang small, awkward songs that sounded terrible and beautiful at once. Noor tasted salt and triumph. Cameras recorded a woman who had ruled by whisper, and paper step into the light of accountability. The recall vote was set. On the day of the vote, the community center was packed. The fluorescent lights hummed. The smell of coffee and pizza recycled through conversation that was both celebratory and sharp. People had printed ballots and petitions and affidavits. The table was a collage of civic action. Claire reminded everyone to maintain decorum. The board had to adhere strictly to bylaws for the vote to stand. The tension was a physical thing. Shoulders up, breath short. Marjorie arrived in a face of pale composure, accompanied by two allies who now looked like men waiting for a verdict. The vote commenced. Each ballot dropped like a small stone into a lake whose concentric rings would not stop. The sound of paper on clipboard was a soft rain. Then the count. Then the reading of the tally. The room held its breath like a body, suspended. The number read, "The recall had passed." A gasp spread, and then a roar. People hugged with the rawness of those who have been through a storm and come out muddy and alive. Noor wept. Eli felt the same steadied pulse he'd felt after a rescue. Relief edged with the knowledge that recovery is work. Marjorie sat like a queen whose crown had gone soft. Her face was a mask, and behind it a splintering. But procedure requires follow-through. Claire moved with the same meticulousness she had used to prepare files. Motions to remove and to appoint an interim board were filed. With the recall validated by the court, the judge ordered an audit. The auditors, stoic, precise, arrived, smelling faintly of bleach and calculation. They went through ledgers with small lamps, hands gloved, fingerprints preserved. What they found was worse than rumors: invoices that did not match events, payments to shell vendors, and exchanges that suggested a pattern of personal use of HOA funds. The evidence was comprehensive enough to demand restitution. The final knowledge. Bomb landed in Act 3 like a detonator under the porch. State statutes often provide mechanisms to dissolve or restructure an HOA if it is found to have acted ultra vires, beyond its powers, or in breach of fiduciary duty. Courts can void board actions, appoint a receiver to manage association assets, require restitution to the community, and in extreme cases dissolve the association's governing body until a lawful, elected interim board is installed. The legal path is narrow and procedural, but when mapped correctly through subpoenas, recalls, and audits, it can dismantle a corrupt regime and restore governance to the homeowners. The fact hung in the air like a verdict. That legal pathway explained the way forward. Claire moved to appoint a receiver while restitution claims were processed. The receiver, an austere woman whose handshake tasted of steel, arrived with a contractor's van and spreadsheets and a plan. She smelled faintly of disinfectant and new beginnings. The receiver's role was not vindictive, it was corrective. She would recover misused funds, renegotiate tainted contracts, and oversee the election of a new board. The sight of her keys on a clerk's ring felt like the final note in a long requiem. Marjorie's last attempts at escape were theatrical and small. She attempted to sell a parcel held in the HOA's name. The title search and the receiver's freeze made the deal fall apart. She hired a PR firm that churned out statements about misunderstandings and heated local politics. But the ledger had teeth, the invoices had numbers, the judge's stamp had weight. The public image she had cultivated, righteous enforcer of community standards, had been replaced by the more complicated portrait of a woman who had let fear write her rules. In the weeks that followed, the community's days returned to a rhythm of repair rather than fear. The community garden was replanted, laughter returned to porches, and the smell of basil in the evening replaced the sour tang of suspicion. Mr. Hines sat on his bench and tapped his cane in a rhythm that was almost a song. Noor taught a cookout class that smelled like cumin and reclaimed joy. People took down cameras that had recorded petty grievances and left instead photo collages of neighborhood events, birthdays, potlucks, an impromptu jazz night where the trumpet tasted like honey in the air, but justice had to be more than symbolic. Restitution payments were made. Vendors who had been co-opted apologized. Some refused payment and donated to a new neighborhood fund. The receiver organized a transparent budget meeting that smelled like printer paper and optimism. The board was reconstituted with new members who had no appetite for petty tyranny, only for governance. The community charter was amended to close loopholes, specify vendor vetting, and require quarterly audits. They added a clause for whistleblower protection. The sense of order felt less like suffocation and more like breathing with a full lung. Marjorie left the neighborhood not with a bang, but with the small flatness of someone who has run out of stories. She sold her silver SUV and moved to a town where fewer eyes were interested in minute compliance. The rumor, because rumor follows like a shadow, said she taught a civics class and grew hydrangeas that she spoke to. Noor saw her once at a community fundraiser months later. Marjorie's eyes were blank and she said nothing. There was no spectacle, There was only the slow collapse of a private empire. Eli, who had never wanted the spotlight, found himself called to speak at a civic forum. He spoke not about victory, but about the work of community, collecting records, filing complaints, looking out for one another. He spoke about the tacit power of neighbors when they act together, and the corrosive influence of secret money and personal vendettas. He used the metaphor of search and rescue. We find the person under the rubble by listening. The crowd, faces, shining under auditorium lights that smelled like popcorn, listened. After, people lined up to say thank you and tell stories of their own small tyrannies. The room tasted like coffee and hope. The last week of the legal drama concluded with an order: restitution paid, board actions voided where procedures had been violated, and a court-mandated oversight period overseen by the receiver until the newly elected board proved its capacity. The judge's words were careful but firm. Communities cannot be run as personal fiefdoms. The gavel's sound was a punctuation that felt like release. People cried. People laughed. Noor's hand in Eli's felt like a promise kept, on a humid evening. Not long after the legal dust settled, the neighborhood held a celebration, less a party and more a reclamation ceremony. The smell of barbecue and lemon cake filled the air. The arch under which their wedding had almost been stopped stood repaired and stronger. The groom, now thinking back to the salute that had seemed at once absurd and portentous, stood in a tux that had lived through the courthouse. He raised his glass. Police officers from the precinct, men and women who had stood in the crowd and saluted not out of theater but recognition, were present too. They smiled, not always perfectly, but sincerely. The soundtrack of the night was small. Laughter, the clink of glasses, the cranking of a folk guitar. The taste of iced tea was crisp and clean. Eli walked the perimeter, feeling the wood of the fence under his fingers, the smell of cedar and candle wax. He thought of maps and rescues and the small, precise way a community had remade itself. He had not wanted a war. He had wanted his home. But he had learned something. Rules are only as good as the people who enforce them. If enforcement becomes a weapon, then the only remedy is sunlight, procedure, and neighbors who refuse to be cowed. The story closed the way it began, on a sharp, cinematic beat. The final image was simple and thumbnail ready. The HOA sign at the UBA, the entrance once glossy and triumphant, now visibly repainted with a small sticker over the corner that read, "Community First." Underneath, children played with the smell of chalk and sweat and laughter wrapping the afternoon like a blanket. Noor and Eli stood watching, their hands clasped, the taste of a long battle settling into something softer. If you're watching this and your neighborhood knows the sting of petty power, drop a comment now. Where are you watching from? Tell us your city so we can map the reach of HOA overreach. If your community has been silenced by bylaws twisted into weapons, write yes and share what happened. If you believe no one is above procedure, hit subscribe so we can keep exposing the tricks and the loopholes. Like, share, and tag a neighbor who needs to know this. The more we see, the less power bullies have to hide. Remember, power cowers in the dark. Shine a light, save your receipts, gather your neighbors. In the end, justice was not a single hero, but a tired, patient community that learned to act together. It was messy, expensive, and human, but it worked. So go, tell your story, protect your garden. And if you want another HOA takedown, another revelation where a paperwork trail becomes a rope for accountability, click subscribe. We've only started to map what happens when neighbors refuse to be quiet. Share this, comment, subscribe, press the bell. This takedown was for every person who's been told to mind their place. Now the place belongs to everyone.